I begin with that to get us into the economy, Mr. Speaker. And I have to tell you, I have the Vice Chairman of the Budget Committee, House Budget Committee, down here with me today, the gentleman Todd Rokita from Indiana. The Budget Committee right now is involved in the gargantuan task of trying to balance the federal budget, present that budget to this House before April. But their task is complicated, Mr. Speaker. You can't see the chart that I have, but their task is complicated because economic growth in America is slowing. The obstructionism in the Senate, the obstructionism from the White House can't build simple things like the Keystone Pipeline. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, one of the greatest public works projects in the history of our nation, the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam was built in less time than it's taken the White House to consider the application for this short pipeline connecting America and Canada. We built the Hoover Dam more quickly than we can sign off on the paperwork for a pipeline. Let me show you what the impact of that is. Economic growth. In 2013, Mr. Speaker, CBO projected GDP would be growing about 3% a year, 2.9 to be precise. By last year in February, when they gave us their projections, they'd lowered it to 2.5%. Today, January 2015, they've lowered it to 2.3%. Mr. Speaker, that's not just 2.9 to 2.3. That is trillions of dollars in economic activity. Trillions. It looks small on this page, but it is giant on the federal budget, and it's even bigger when you talk about the job creation that hasn't occurred. It's even bigger when you talk about the Americans who are trapped in part-time work. It's even bigger when you talk about young people graduating from college who cannot find a job. That's the impact of obstructionism. That's the impact of inaction. That is the impact of having a former majority leader, now minority leader in the Senate, who, as the newspaper headlines say, has changed his tune. I've heard folks say it. I laugh, Mr. Speaker. It's not funny. It's sad. But I've heard folks say, well, what are you complaining about, Rob? Deficits have come down by half in President Obama's administration. They've come down by half. Well, that's true. When I showed up here 4 years ago, Mr. Speaker, deficits were at their single highest rate in the history of the nation. And by single highest rate, I mean they were 4 times higher than they had ever before been. And so they've dropped from being 4 times higher than ever before down to just higher than ever before. You can call that progress, but I have it charted here as a percent of the size of the economy, Mr. Speaker. I go all the way back to 1965. We've had Republicans, we've had Democrats, we've had Republicans in Congress, Democrats in Congress, Republicans in the White House, Democrats in the White House. This isn't about the parties. For Pete's sakes, if we look here for the only surpluses in our nation's history, it comes in a time where we had, much like we do today, Republicans here in this institution, Republicans in the United States Senate, and Democrats leading from the White House. It was in a bipartisan way we created some economic growth. But what I want you to see, Mr. Speaker, is that we come here into the current administration dramatically higher than ever before in American history, dramatically higher. Coming down to the dotted line I have on the chart, Mr. Speaker, is the historical average. From 1965 to 2014 now, it is embarrassing for the both of us that we have to talk about our nation's finances by the historical deficit. Neither one of us came here to be involved in deficit spending. We came here to stop borrowing from our children and from our grandchildren, to start being responsible by paying the bills today, to improve opportunity in the future, not to diminish and borrow from opportunity in the future, but that's been the historical average. But what you'd see if you could see this chart, Mr. Speaker, is that even as the White House is preaching the good news of declining deficits, they have only declined from those record highs. They've declined to a level where they're going to continue to rise again at levels higher than the historical average. You know, the President just sent his budget 2 weeks ago now, Mr. Speaker. He sent that budget. It arrived here on time for the first time in his administration. I applaud him for that. But it never balances, never ever. Not this year, not next year, not 10 years from now, not 20 years from now, not 100 years from now. The idea of the United States of America and the budget that should control it from the President's point of view, is a budget that should never, ever balance, and thus a budget that should continue year after year to borrow from the prosperity of future generations so that we can spend it on ourselves. That's selfish in ways that I can't be a part of. What's the nature of the problem, Mr. Speaker? We're talking about this in the Budget Committee right now. Total spending in this country, about $3.5 trillion this year. The little part that Congress has control over, it's the defense and the non-defense discretionary, this little corner of the pie. We're able to control that. In fact, Mr. Rakita, the Vice Chairman of the Budget Committee, arrived here in 2010 as I did. Every single year since you have been here, leading at the Budget Committee, I say the gentleman from Indiana, we have reduced that discretionary spending every single year. It hasn't been easy. It hasn't been easy. It has been hard, deliberate, bipartisan work, but you've done it because it was the right thing to do. $3.5 trillion is a lot of money, but the small part that you've had control over, you've made a difference in. It's the rest of this pie that continues to grow. You have to yield, my friend.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. The gentleman is exactly right. And by the way, while I'm at it, let me just say that the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is a blessing not only for this Congress and for the people of Georgia, but for this country because of the tenacity you bring, the energy you bring. And if I had a list of all the pieces of legislation, all the things that we've got done around here for the last 4 years that you and I have been in here, that you had your fingers on, that you weren't mentioned about, I mean, for the work you've done behind the scenes, that list would be very long, probably go out these doors. One of the things that you've done, that we have done together, is for the first time since the Korean War, we have cut discretionary spending for 4 years in a row. Hadn't been done since the Korean War. Now, as you pointed out in earlier slides, there's a lot more work to do, and we're gonna continue to get to it. We need a partner at some point. You know, we need people to put on what I call their big boy pants and their big girl skirts and get to the bottom of this, and that is getting to a balanced budget. And I'll tell you, this pie chart is very good. You're exactly right, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Woodall is exactly right. The two blue pieces that we pull out for you in this pie chart are what you would get at in a traditional regular budget process. This is what we call our discretionary spending, both in the non-defense area and the defense area. And as you can see, it's really no more than 2/3 or 40%, or excuse me, 1/3 or 40% of our total federal spend. The rest, all that red that you see there, is on what we call autopilot spending, because the budget line by line doesn't touch that. Why? Because it's on autopilot. That's your Medicare, that's your Medicaid, that's your Social Security, that's your interest that we owe ourselves and other countries for all this debt, because that's a contract. And that red is just going to continue to grow as a percentage of that pie until it takes up nearly all of it over the next several years. And then we're not going to have the money we need to spend on the things that constitutionally we need to spend it on, like defense, like some of the other 167 other agencies around here. And that's a bad, bad situation. That's unsustainable. But in law, that is Social Security, that is Medicare, that is Medicaid, that's the other mandatory spending, until you reform those programs so that they fit how we live in the 21st century, so that they can be saved for our children and for our grandchildren, then you're really never going to get to balancing the budget or paying down this awful debt, something that I can't imagine really anything more immoral than passing on to future Americans, our children and grandchildren who do not yet exist, this burden. Talk about taxation without representation. Well, thank you, Mr. Woodall. I appreciate it letting me, as a member of the Budget Committee, under the excellent leadership of Chairman Price, chime in here. We're going to have a budget, the 5th time we'll do it in a row here by the statutory deadline. We intend to get it over to the Senate, and we intend to move this country forward. And again, I say, Mr. Speaker, chiming in with Mr. Woodall, I hope we have a partner this time. I hope we have personal responsibility on the floor of this House and the floor of the other chamber. Thank you very much.
I thank the Vice Chairman of the Budget Committee. Mr. Speaker, people think these things happen in a vacuum. They don't. They happen because folks like Mr. Rakita take time away from their family, away from their constituents back home even sometimes, to work the long nights, the early mornings it takes to get a budget like this done. Just to give you an example, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you've ever thought about it. $3.5 trillion is the size of our annual spending. Annual spending. People often characterize, and I would tell you mischaracterize, Republicans as folks who want to shut down government. That's nonsense. You heard the gentleman from Indiana's heart as he was up here earlier talking about his love for people, the needs that people have, and our opportunity to aid people and their families as they struggle with some of those challenges. We spend $3.5 trillion a year in that effort. It's not that we don't want to spend the money, it's that we want to spend it effectively, efficiently, and accountably. That's all folks ask for back home. They don't say shut the government down. They say spend my tax money effectively, efficiently, and accountably. $3.5 trillion, Mr. Speaker. If any of the young people who are coming to Congress to watch what goes on here on the floor of the House, Mr. Speaker, if any of those young people were born the day that Jesus Christ was born, and beginning on that day, they spent $1 million every day. $1 million every day, 7 days a week, Mr. Speaker, from the day that Jesus Christ was born until today. They would have to continue spending $1 million a day, every day, 7 days a week, for another 732 years to spend their first $1 trillion. As a federal government, we're spending $3.5 trillion every year. And we've borrowed from those same young people $18 trillion that they're going to have to pay back one day. These numbers are mind-boggling, and sometimes I wonder if we as a chamber, Mr. Speaker, are taking this crisis as seriously as we must. It is at its core a spending crisis. It is not a revenue crisis. It's not that $3.5 trillion isn't enough to handle the needs of this country. It is. This chart, Mr. Speaker, you can't see it, but it's a historical chart of spending, which is in the red, and revenues, which is in the green. Now, when we've had this big economic downturn here, so many families out of work, so many families in part-time work, so many young people who couldn't find jobs, revenues absolutely went down. They went down because there were no jobs, and if folks don't have jobs, they don't have incomes, and if they don't have incomes, they can't pay taxes. We want people to go to work. You can't pay taxes if you don't have a job. But historically, Americans have been willing to pay about 18% of GDP in tax revenue, and so I draw that line on out for the foreseeable future. But the red line represents spending in this town, Mr. Speaker. The red line represents if we did nothing, if we adjourned the Congress this afternoon and we went down to the Pennsylvania Avenue and we picked up the president and we all left Washington forever. I was wondering if there was going to be a loud group of cheers and applause that broke out when I say that, Mr. Speaker. I'm not actually advocating for that, but if that were to happen, the laws that are already on the books have made promises to people that spend the money on this red line going into historical debt territory, the likes of which we have never seen and we cannot survive as a nation. Is the problem. The red line is the problem. The green line, this is what we take from American families in taxes. It's been constant over time, not constant in actual dollars, but constant as a percent of the economy. It's the red line that's growing ever faster. Now, if you'll permit me to scare you just a little bit further, Mr. Speaker, let me talk about interest rates in this country. Interest rates in this country. This chart right here, you can't see it again, Mr. Speaker, but it's charting the interest rates that America is paying on its debt. You know, we borrow in all sorts of different instruments, from short-term, week-long instruments all the way up to 30-year instruments. I put on the 3-month bills and our 10-year notes on this chart. This chart covers most of my lifetime, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it goes a little further than my lifetime. And what you're going to see, Mr. Speaker, going all the way back to 1965, it's charting the 3-month notes, the 3-month bills, the 10-year notes. This is where we are today. This is where we are today. And what you see here, Mr. Speaker, is that we are at the lowest level of interest in the history of our country. In the history of our country, we have never paid less on federal debt than we are paying today, yet we have never had more of it. And so what do you think is going to happen, Mr. Speaker, when these low interest rates that we have today return to these historically high levels? In fact, the economists, as I've pointed out here in blue, project that interest rates will return. And by return, I mean that our 10-year notes are going to more than double. I mean that our 3-month bills are going to more than sextuple. We're talking about an interest rate explosion around the corner, Mr. Speaker, that we're not going to be able to sustain. Now, let me take you back to what we're spending today. As we sit here today, we're spending $229 billion in interest on our national debt. $229 billion, while we're at the lowest interest rates in American history. Now, if the rates on those 10-year notes are going to double, if the rates on those 3-year bills are going to, 3-month bills are going to sextuple, what do you think $229 billion changes into within the next 3 or 4 years, Mr. Speaker? It doesn't change into $300 billion. It doesn't change into $400 billion. It goes northward of $500 billion in interest. In fact, as the President lays out his budget, we're looking at almost $1 trillion a year in interest payments within the next 10 years, in a single year at year 10. $1 trillion, Mr. Speaker, enough money to pay for all of our national security, enough money to pay for all of the Medicaid program or the Medicare program, enough money to pay for the entire Social Security program for a year. We're going to throw it away in interest payments because we didn't have the discipline to control spending in this bipartisan Congress that we have. Lowest interest rates in American history, Mr. Speaker. Every economist projects a rise doubling to sextupling in the next 10 years. We're only borrowing money, Mr. Speaker, because we have lots of spending going on. And there are those who believe that the more we spend, the better results we're going to get. I want to tell you that's nonsense. If this chamber were full to capacity today, Mr. Speaker, and we ask folks to have a show of hands of when was that great time in the American economy they remember, when were the cares of whether or not you could afford to pay your house note, whether you could afford to pay your car note, whether you could afford to take care of your children, when was the time that those cares were the least? I dare say most of the hands would think back to the 1990s. Whew. The economy was on fire. You remember that. The stock market was on fire. You had to hide under a rock to keep from finding a good job. Again, Republicans controlling this institution, Democrats in the White House, we were working together to constrain spending, to grow the economy. But this chart that I have here, Mr. Speaker, shows per capita spending. Per capita spending, right? It's not really meaningful to talk about spending in the abstract. It all distills down to an individual man, an individual woman, an individual family. What are we spending on individuals here in this country? So this is a federal outlays per individual. You'll see a constant illustration. This is World War II, where we were really fighting for the future of not just the republic, but of the world. Going through the Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration, this is per capita spending, and you see that it increases. You know, as inflation does, as government does, it just naturally rises little by little, year after year. But what you will see, Mr. Speaker, if you look here at the Clinton years in blue, that in those years that Americans would look back on with fondness and contentment, those years where the cares of the world seemed just a little bit lighter on their shoulders, we weren't spending more from Washington, D.C. It didn't require more spending from Washington, D.C. The stimulation of the economy is not dependent on spending from Washington, D.C. In fact, arguably, it is the opposite. The more Washington sucks out of America, the less that individual Americans have to grow their families, grow their businesses, expand their opportunities. It is meaningful to me, again, you think about the Reagan years, you think about the first Bush years, you think about the Clinton years, the economy on fire, spending from the federal government held constant. Fast forward to today, Mr. Speaker, you see spending begin to grow out of control. It happened in the Bush years. Again, this is not a partisan problem. This is an American problem. Spending began to grow. We're fighting a war on terror. Folks are beginning to worry about their families, worry about their jobs. Spending today continuing on that rise. Well, continuing until I arrived here in 2010, until you arrived here in 2014, when the cavalry arrived here to say, wait a minute. I know the challenges are vast, but we can't just push the can down the road. We can't pass our problems on to the next generation. We have to confront those problems together, and that's what we've been doing in this budget. Mr. Speaker, this chart shows if we do nothing, if we never make another promise, and the budget the President just sent us is full of new promises to the tune of about $2 trillion over the next 10 years. If we never make another promise, if all we do is keep the promises we've already made, if we never pass a new law or a new bill to do something else, simply by the force of the laws already on the books, debt grows to levels higher than we borrowed as a nation to defeat the Nazis in World War II. Think about that, Mr. Speaker. I was down in front of the White House. I had some friends in town. I took them down to see the White House. All Americans ought to make that journey. It's the center of the executive branch here in Washington, D.C. And we walked over to the old executive office building. As you know, that's a fabulous, fabulous building. And on the front steps of the old executive office building, they have two cannons from the Spanish-American War, 1898. And they have a little plaque there on the fence. Of course, you can't get through the fence. In fact, they pushed you back a little further now with the new Secret Service regulations. But you can see the plaque hanging there on the fence. And it says, we used to have more than 20 of these historic cannons around town, dating back to the Revolutionary War. But during World War II, we melted most of them down to be a part of the war effort. Think about that. In World War II, the situation was so dire, Mr. Speaker, we were going around to our national monuments. We were going around to our nation's history. We were finding anything made of iron or steel, and we were melting it down. Because World War II wasn't a fight, it was the fight for freedom on the planet. And amidst that terror, ration stamps across the land, folks standing in lines for food at the end of the Great Depression. Amidst all of that turmoil, all of that crisis, arguably the greatest crisis not just this nation has known, but the world has ever known, America borrowed about 100% of the size of its economy. That's a heavy load. But it was for an important cause. As we sit here today, Mr. Speaker, we've borrowed about 3/4 of that same load. And if we change no law, and if we make no new promises, we will borrow not 2 times, not 3 times, but 4 times more than we borrowed to defeat the greatest evil the world has ever known, just to keep the lights on in the United States of America. That's dangerous, and it's irresponsible. Mr. Speaker, you can count on a budget coming to the floor of this House. It's going to be here. I would guess it's going to be here on the floor by the end of March, but certainly we'll have it here by April. It's going to be a budget that brings us back to balance, and it's going to be a budget that makes the hard decisions that have to be made. No one's saying don't invest in America. What they're saying is don't let growing interest payments on irresponsible borrowing push out the room in the budget to invest in America. You know, we're investing less in America today, Mr. Speaker, than any other time in my lifetime. We're investing less. Now, we're spending more, but we're investing less because, as I showed you on that pie chart earlier, Mr. Speaker, what we're spending on isn't investments in America. It's income maintenance programs. If we do nothing, revenues continue, debt grows out of control. 2046, Mr. Speaker, about the time you're entering your retirement, debt at 250% of GDP. Spending $3.5 trillion today at the lowest rate of interest the country has ever known. And today, in that most favorable of environments, Mr. Speaker, we are almost spending more on interest than we are on our Medicaid program, the health care program that covers children and the poor across this land. We are spending more to pay our creditors than we are to protect our children's health. And that's at the lowest rates of interest the country has ever known. It only grows. And that's if the only thing that changes are the interest rates, Mr. Speaker. That's if we stop borrowing more money. But the President projects to borrow half trillion after half trillion after half trillion after half trillion. In fact, as I said, the budget he presented never, ever, ever comes to balance. Borrows year after year after year after year as far as the eye can see. I don't argue that that's not the easier decision to make today, Mr. Speaker. It is. Doing nothing is always easier than doing the heavy lifting. Spending and borrowing more, always easier than tightening your belt and making the tough calls. Sacrificing our children's future so that we don't have to make those tough decisions today, that may be the easy call, but it's immoral. It's immoral, Mr. Speaker. We have been able to cut budgets, as the gentleman from Indiana said, 4 years in a row for the first time in my lifetime. We are moving the needle, but there is more to do. And it can't be done alone. It can't be done with just Republicans. It can't be done with just Democrats. And it can't be done with just the Congress. It requires the House Republicans and Democrats. It requires the Senate Republicans and Democrats. And it requires the President of the United States to come together to make those decisions that matter. Mr. Speaker, we'll be talking a lot more about this in the coming weeks. I want to make sure that every American has all the answers they need about how we're trying to prioritize in this budget. But I want to be clear. The days of kicking the can down the road ended when Republicans took over this chamber in 2011. The trust and confidence that we've earned in a bipartisan way over the last 4 years, we're going to continue today. And Senate willing, going back to the obstructionist provisions I noted at the very beginning of this hour, Mr. Speaker, Senate willing, we will conference the first budget, agree on the first budget, have the first American budget in my entire tenure in Congress. The House has always done its job. This year we have an opportunity to have the Congress do its job collectively, and I look forward to that conclusion. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to you for being down here with me this afternoon, and I yield back the balance of my time.